Alright, welcome back. This is the final lecture of this particular section on the basic Swift concepts, and this one is all about initialization. I'd like to go over this in a little bit more detail because I believe it's a confusing topic for people who are just starting out. I know it was for me. So let's cover a few things. I do have a new playground opened up here. I saved it as initialization. So let's get started. First off, I'm going to paste in some comments here about initialization. So let's just go ahead and read about those. Yes, you've already seen some of this initialization stuff in the previous lectures, but I do want to discuss just a bit more about it. Okay, so very simply, initialization is the process of preparing an instance of a class, structure, or enumeration for use. Okay, it involves setting an initial value for each stored property, should be a D there, stored property, which is just variables and whatnot, and performing any other setup that's required. And it's just a way for Xcode to ensure that new instances are correctly initialized before they're used for the first time. So this avoids errors and whatnot, so it's actually a good thing, even though if it seems a little confusing. And as I mentioned, they're called to create a new instance. So here is an example of the most simple type of initialization. Here's the structure of it. Okay, so the keyword is init. And in this particular example, since it's very simple, there's nothing inside of the parentheses, just open, closed, then a set of curly brackets as you're used to, and inside of those brackets is where you perform the actual initialization. So let's create a struct. We'll initialize a struct, and let's call it Fahrenheit. So inside of the struct that we've just created, let's say we have a stored property which is temperature. Okay, and that temperature, let's say it's a double. Makes the most sense. Okay, so that's there, but we do need to initialize an initial value for this temperature. So of course we will use the init keyword, and let's just say we do temperature is equal to 32.0. Okay, so now we have our struct, we have our property within the struct, and that property is initialized to a starting value of 32 degrees. So now let's try this. Let's do var. We'll create a new variable, we'll call it temp, and let's say that it is an instance of Fahrenheit. So far so good. So now let's see what happens when we do the following. Let's do print. We'll say the default temperature is, and we'll access temp.temperature, and we'll say Fahrenheit just to make the sentence nice and neat. And you're going to see, of course, 32. And there it is, of course. The default temperature is 32.0. That's what initialization is. If we wanted the default temperature to be 100, this will clearly change, and there we are. So yes, the structure defines a single initializer, init, with no parameters, empty parentheses here, which initializes the stored temperature, which is this variable, to a default value of what we set it to. And right now it's 100. Okay, next I'm going to paste in another comment here. As you have seen this already, you can customize the initialization process by including parameters in the initialization itself. So let's do one of those. This is more practice for you, it's important. So let's do a struct, and we'll call it Celsius. Now let's say we want a variable called temperature in Celsius. Let's say we want it to be a double. Now we can customize the initialization a bit more. So here's our keyword init. We're going to put some parameters inside of the parentheses. So let's say we're going to call it from Fahrenheit, and we'll say it's a Fahrenheit value, which will be a double. So now the initialization is requiring this parameter, and we will say temperature in Celsius, which is the variable right here, temperature in Celsius will be equal to the Fahrenheit value minus 32.0, and that's divided by 1.8. So that is the actual conversion. If you take the Fahrenheit value, subtract 32 from it, divide by 1.8. That's the actual conversion. So here are the details there. This initializer converts its single argument into a corresponding Celsius value. and stores this value in a property called temperature in Celsius. Take some time and read over everything here from the struct Fahrenheit all the way down to this comment. Go through and make sure you understand that flow. What is happening? I know initialization is a little bit tricky and difficult to understand, but the more you practice with it, the better you'll get. So let's see the result of our Celsius struct. What happens? Well, let's make a constant called boiling point of water. So let's say that we want to use the Celsius struct. So we want to use from Fahrenheit. So now, well, there's an error because we didn't finish typing in the number here. In case you didn't already know, depending where you live, in Fahrenheit, the boiling point of water is 212 degrees, right? In Celsius, it's 100. If we know the Fahrenheit value, we input it, and our Celsius struct will do the conversion itself. So now let's do print boiling point of water, and it will do the Celsius conversion, and we'll see 100. See, there we go. So that's how this initialization within this struct actually works. However, here is the most simple way to initialize. Just give default values. All right, so here actually is the most simple way to initialize. Let's say we create a class called drink recipe item, and let's say we have a var ingredient name, which is an optional string. Var amount equals, let's just say 0.5. Var added equals false. So since we type things out this way, see, it's a little bit different than this here initialization. We're actually giving them values automatically here, so it's a little different type of syntax, and it's a very simple initialization, and it works. So now we can just do a var item equals drink recipe, and there's no errors at all because drink recipe item knows that it has an optional, which of course you know by now doesn't need to necessarily have a value. And then we have a value for the amount and a value for added. So that's why var item as a drink recipe item does not complain to the compiler at all. However, watch if we did this. Var double, see, now we get an error. It's angry because there is no initialization of the var amount double. However, if we decide to make this an optional, the error will go away. See, now var item drink recipe item is fine. I know it might be a little confusing, but yes, you do need to give default values to items that are not optionals. Optionals can be left alone precisely because they're optionals, but if you're going to have a variable that is a non-optional, you need to either initialize it this way, or perhaps this way, or the simplest way, just give it a value. So last but not least, I just wanted to paste in this comment here. All of the variables have default values. Drink recipe item automatically gains a default initializer implementation that creates a new instance with all of its properties set to their default values. So that is a little bit more detail about initialization, which should help you along the way as you start building your own apps. At least you know when you get an initialization error, it's going to be most likely related to one of these three types of patterns of actually initializing some sort of object. So you can come back to this playground and get a little idea of what you need to do to fix your mistakes. Okay, so that wraps up this section on Basic Swift. You've learned a heck of a lot, and we're going to move on now, and we're going to actually build another app now. This is going to be more complex than our little introductory app in the previous section. So we're going to use a lot of the tools that you've learned in this section to create a little more complex app that changes color, and you'll see that's much more functional than the introductory app that you started this course with. So without further ado, let's move on to the next section, which is color changer. I will see you then.